The Secret Teachings of All Ages by ManlyPHall. Part 4, Introduction, Philosophy Schols, Part 3-5. Enjoy the listening. Orpheus, the Thracian bard, the great initiator of the Greeks, ceased to be known as a man and was celebrated as a divinity several centuries before the Christian era. As to Orpheus himself, writes Thomas Taylor, scarcely a vestige of his life is to be found amongst the immense ruins of time. For who has ever been able to affirm anything with certainty of his origin, his age, his country, and condition? This alone may be depended on from general assent that there formerly lived a person named Orpheus, who was the founder of theology among the Greeks, the institutor of their lives and morals, the first of prophets and the prince of poets, himself the offspring of a muse, who taught the Greeks their sacred rites and mysteries, and from whose wisdom, as from a perennial and abundant fountain, the divine muse of Homer and the sublime theology of Pythagoras and Plato flowed. Orpheus was founder of the Grecian mythological system, which he used as the medium for the promulgation of his philosophical doctrines. The origin of his philosophy is uncertain. He may have got it from the Brahmins, there being legends to the effect that he got it from a Hindu, his name possibly being derived from Orphicus, meaning dark. Orpheus was initiated into the Egyptian mysteries, from which he secured extensive knowledge of magic, astrology, sorcery, and medicine. The mysteries of the Kabiri at Samothrace were also conferred upon him, and these undoubtedly contributed to his knowledge of medicine and music. The romance of Orpheus and Eurydice is one of the tragic episodes of Greek mythology and apparently constitutes the outstanding feature of the Orphic rite. Eurydice, in her attempt to escape from a villain seeking to seduce her, died from the venom of a poisonous serpent which stung her in the heel. Orpheus, penetrating to the very heart of the underworld, so charmed Pluto and Persephone with the beauty of his music that they agreed to permit Eurydice to return to life if Orpheus could lead her back to the sphere of the living without once looking round to see if she were following. So great was his fear, however, that she would stray from him that he turned his head, and Eurydice with a heartbroken cry was swept back into the land of death. Orpheus wandered the earth for a while disconsolate, and there are several conflicting accounts of the manner of his death. Some declare that he was slain by a bolt of lightning. Others, that failing to save his beloved Eurydice, he committed suicide. The generally accepted version of his death, however, is that he was torn to pieces by Ciconian women whose advances he had spurned. In the 10th book of Plato's Republic, it is declared that because of his sad fate at the hands of women, the soul that had once been Orpheus, upon being destined to live again in the physical world, chose rather to return in the body of a swan than be born of woman. The head of Orpheus, after being torn from his body, was cast with his lyre into the river Hebrus, down which it floated to the sea, where, wedging in a cleft in a rock, it gave oracles for many years. The lyre, after being stolen from its shrine and working the destruction of the thief, was picked up by the gods and fashioned into a constellation. Orpheus has long been sung as the patron of music. On his 7-stringed lyre, he played such perfect harmonies that the gods themselves were moved to acclaim his power. When he touched the strings of his instrument, the birds and beasts gathered about him, and as he wandered through the forests, his enchanting melodies caused even the ancient trees with mighty effort to draw their gnarled roots from out the earth and follow him. Orpheus is one of the many immortals who have sacrificed themselves that mankind might have the wisdom of the gods. By the symbolism of his music, he communicated the divine secrets to humanity, and several authors have declared that the gods, though loving him, feared that he would overthrow their kingdom and therefore reluctantly encompassed his destruction. As time passed on, the historical Orpheus became hopelessly confounded with the doctrine he represented, and eventually became the symbol of the Greek school of the ancient wisdom. Thus Orpheus was declared to be the son of Apollo, the divine and perfect truth, and Calliope, the muse of harmony and rhythm. In other words, Orpheus is the secret doctrine, Apollo, revealed through music, Calliope. Eurydice is humanity dead from the sting of the serpent of false knowledge and imprisoned in the underworld of ignorance. In this allegory, Orpheus signifies theology, which wins her from the king of the dead, but fails to accomplish her resurrection because it falsely estimates and mistrusts the innate understanding within the human soul. The Baconian women who tore Orpheus limb from limb symbolize the various contending theological factions which destroy the body of truth. They cannot accomplish this, however, until their discordant cries drown out the harmony drawn by Orpheus from his magic lyre. The head of Orpheus signifies the esoteric doctrines of his cult. These doctrines continue to live and speak even after his body, the cult, has been destroyed. The lyre is the secret teaching of Orpheus. The 7 strings are the 7 divine truths which are the keys to universal knowledge. The differing accounts of his death represent the various means used to destroy the secret teachings. Wisdom can die in many ways at the same time. The allegory of Orpheus incarnating in the white swan merely signifies that the spiritual truths he promulgated will continue and will be taught by the illumined initiates of all future ages. The swan is the symbol of the initiates of the mysteries. It is a symbol also of the divine power, which is the progenitor of the world. The Bacchic rite centers around the allegory of the youthful Bacchus, Dionysos or Zagreus, being torn to pieces by the Titans. These giants accomplish the destruction of Bacchus by causing him to become fascinated by his own image in a mirror. After dismembering him, the Titans first boiled the pieces in water and afterwards roasted them. Pallas rescued the heart of the murdered god, and by this precaution Bacchus, Dionysos, was enabled to spring forth again in all his former glory. Jupiter, the demiurgus, beholding the crime of the Titans, hurled his thunderbolts and slew them, burning their bodies to ashes with heavenly fire. Out of the ashes of the Titans, which also contained a portion of the flesh of Bacchus, whose body they had partly devoured, the human race was created. Thus, the mundane life of every man was said to contain a portion of the Bacchic life. For this reason, the Greek mysteries warned against suicide. He who attempts to destroy himself raises his hand against the nature of Bacchus within him, since man's body is indirectly the tomb of this god and consequently must be preserved with the greatest care. Bacchus, Dionysos, represents the rational soul of the inferior world. He is the chief of the Titans, the artificers of the mundane spheres. The Pythagoreans called him the Titanic monad. Thus Bacchus is the all-inclusive idea of the Titanic sphere, and the Titans, or gods of the fragments, the active agencies by means of which universal substance is fashioned into the pattern of this idea. The Bacchic state signifies the unity of the rational soul in a state of self-knowledge, and the Titanic state the diversity of the rational soul, which, being scattered throughout creation, loses the consciousness of its own essential oneness. The mirror into which Bacchus gazes, and which is the cause of his fall, is the great sea of illusion, the lower world fashioned by the Titans. Bacchus, the mundane rational soul, seeing his image before him, accepts the image as a likeness of himself and ensouls the likeness. That is, the rational idea ensouls its reflection, the irrational universe. By ensouling the irrational image, it implants in it the urge to become like its source, the rational image. Therefore the ancients said that man does not know the gods by logic or by reason, but rather by realizing the presence of the gods within himself. After Bacchus gazed into the mirror and followed his own reflection into matter, the rational soul of the world was broken up and distributed by the Titans throughout the mundane sphere of which it is the essential nature. But the heart, or source, of it they could not scatter. The Titans took the dismembered body of Bacchus and boiled it in water, symbol of immersion in the material universe, which represents the incorporation of the Bacchic principle in form. The pieces were afterwards roasted to signify the subsequent ascension of the spiritual nature out of form. When Jupiter, the father of Bacchus and the demiurgus of the universe, saw that the Titans were hopelessly involving the rational or divine idea by scattering its members through the constituent parts of the lower world, he slew the Titans in order that the divine idea might not be entirely lost. From the ashes of the Titans, he formed mankind, whose purpose of existence was to preserve and eventually to release the Bacchic idea, or rational soul, from the Titanic fabrication. Jupiter, being the demiurgus and fabricator of the material universe, is the third person of the creative triad, consequently the Lord of Death, for death exists only in the lower sphere of being over which he presides. Disintegration takes place so that reintegration may follow upon a higher level of form or intelligence. The thunderbolts of Jupiter are emblematic of his disintegrative power. They reveal the purpose of death, which is to rescue the rational soul from the devouring power of the irrational nature. Man is a composite creature, his lower nature consisting of the fragments of the Titans, and his higher nature the sacred, immortal flesh, life of Bacchus. Therefore, man is capable of either a titanic, irrational, or a Bacchic, rational existence. The Titans of Hesiod, who were 12 in number, are probably analogous to the celestial zodiac, whereas the Titans who murdered and dismembered Bacchus represent the zodiacal powers distorted by their involvement in the material world. Thus, Bacchus represents the sun who is dismembered by the signs of the zodiac, and from whose body the universe is formed. When the terrestrial forms were created from the various parts of his body, the sense of wholeness was lost, and the sense of separateness established. The heart of Bacchus, which was saved by Pallas or Minerva, was lifted out of the four elements symbolized by his dismembered body and placed in the ether. The heart of Bacchus is the immortal center of the rational soul. After the rational soul had been distributed throughout creation and the nature of man, the Bacchic mysteries were instituted for the purpose of disentangling it from the irrational titanic nature. This disentanglement was the process of lifting the soul out of the state of separateness into that of unity. The various parts and members of Bacchus were collected from the different corners of the earth. When all the rational parts are gathered, Bacchus is resurrected. The rites of Dionysos were very similar to those of Bacchus, and by many these two gods are considered as one. Statues of Dionysos were carried in the Eleusinian mysteries, especially the lesser degrees. Bacchus, representing the soul of the mundane sphere, was capable of an infinite multiplicity of form and designations. Dionysos apparently was his solar aspect. The Dionysiac architects constituted an ancient secret society, in principles and doctrines much like the modern Freemasonic order. They were an organization of builders bound together by their secret knowledge of the relationship between the earthly and the divine sciences of architects. They were supposedly employed by King Solomon in the building of his temple, although they were not Jews, nor did they worship the god of the Jews, being followers of Bacchus and Dionysos. The Dionysiac architects erected many of the great monuments of antiquity. They possessed a secret language and a system of marking their stones. They had annual convocations and sacred feasts. The exact nature of their doctrines is unknown. It is believed that C. Hiram Abiff was an initiate of this society. Atlantis is the subject of a short but important article appearing in the annual report of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution for the year ending June 30th, 1915. The author, M. Pierre Termier, a member of the Academy of Sciences and Director of Service of the Geologic Chart of France, in 1912 delivered a lecture on the Atlantean hypothesis before the Institut Oceanographique. It is the translated notes of this remarkable lecture that are published in the Smithsonian Report. After a long period of disdainful indifference, writes M. Termier, observe how in the last few years science is returning to the study of Atlantis. How many naturalists, geologists, zoologists, or botanists are asking one another today whether Plato has not transmitted to us, with slight amplification, a page from the actual history of mankind. No affirmation is yet permissible. But it seems more and more evident that a vast region, continental or made up of great islands, has collapsed west of the Pillars of Hercules, otherwise called the Strait of Gibraltar, and that its collapse occurred in the not far distant past. In any event, the question of Atlantis is placed anew before men of science. And since I do not believe that it can ever be solved without the aid of oceanography, I have thought it natural to discuss it here, in this temple of maritime science, and to call to such a problem, long scorned but now being revived, the attention of oceanographers, as well as the attention of those who, though immersed in the tumult of cities, lend an ear to the distant murmur of the sea. In his lecture, M. Termier presents geologic, geographic, and zoologic data in substantiation of the Atlantis theory. Figuratively draining the entire bed of the Atlantic Ocean, he considers the inequalities of its basin and cites locations on a line from the Azores to Iceland, where dredging has brought lava to the surface from a depth of 3,000 meters. The volcanic nature of the islands now existing in the Atlantic Ocean corroborates Plato's statement that the Atlantean continent was destroyed by volcanic cataclysms. M. Termier also advances the conclusions of a young French zoologist, M. Louis Germain, who admitted the existence of an Atlantic continent connected with the Iberian Peninsula, and with Mauritania, and prolonged toward the south so as to include some regions of desert climate. M. Termier concludes his lecture with a graphic picture of the engulfment of that continent. The description of the Atlantean civilization given by Plato and the Critias may be summarized as follows. In the first ages, the gods divided the earth among themselves, proportioning it according to their respective dignities. Each became the peculiar deity of his own allotment and established therein temples to himself, ordained a priestcraft, and instituted a system of sacrifice. To Poseidon was given the sea and the island continent of Atlantis. In the midst of the island was a mountain which was the dwelling place of 3 earth-born primitive human beings, Evener, his wife, Leucippe, and their only daughter, Cleito. The maiden was very beautiful, and after the sudden death of her parents she was wooed by Poseidon, who begat by her 5 pairs of male children. Poseidon apportioned his continent among these 10, and Atlas, the eldest, he made overlord of the other 9. Poseidon further called the country Atlantis, and the surrounding sea the Atlantic in honor of Atlas. Before the birth of his 10 sons, Poseidon divided the continent and the coastwise sea into concentric zones of land and water, which were as perfect as though turned upon a lathe. 2 zones of land and 3 of water surrounded the central island, which Poseidon caused to be irrigated with 2 springs of water, one warm and the other cold. The descendants of Atlas continued as rulers of Atlantis, and with wise government and industry elevated the country to a position of surpassing dignity. The natural resources of Atlantis were apparently limitless. Precious metals were mined, wild animals domesticated, and perfumes distilled from its fragrant flowers. While enjoying the abundance natural to their semitropic location, the Atlanteans employed themselves also in the erection of palaces, temples, and docks. They bridged the zones of sea and later dug a deep canal to connect the outer ocean with the central island, where stood the palaces and temple of Poseidon, which excelled all other structures in magnificence. A network of bridges and canals was created by the Atlanteans to unite the various parts of their kingdom. Plato then describes the white, black, and red stones which they quarried from beneath their continent and used in the construction of public buildings and docks. They circumscribed each of the land zones with a wall, the outer wall being covered with brass, the middle with tin, and the inner, which encompassed the citadel, with orichalch. The citadel on the central island contained the palaces, temples, and other public buildings. In its center, surrounded by a wall of gold, was a sanctuary dedicated to Cleito and Poseidon. Here the first 10 princes of the island were born, and here each year their descendants brought offerings. Poseidon's own temple, its exterior entirely covered with silver and its pinnacles with gold, also stood within the citadel. The interior of the temple was of ivory, gold, silver, and orichalch, even to the pillars and floor. The temple contained a colossal statue of Poseidon standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, about him 100 nereids riding on dolphins. Arranged outside the building were golden statues of the first 10 kings and their wives. In the groves and gardens were hot and cold springs. There were numerous temples to various deities, places of exercise for men and for beasts, public baths, and a great race course for horses. At various vantage points on the zones were fortifications, and to the great harbor came vessels from every maritime nation. The zones were so thickly populated that the sound of human voices was ever in the air. That part of Atlantis facing, the sea was described as lofty and precipitous, but about the central city was a plain sheltered by mountains renowned for their size, number, and beauty. The plain yielded 2 crops each year, in the winter being watered by rains and in the summer by immense irrigation canals, which were also used for transportation. The plain was divided into sections, and in time of war each section supplied its quota of fighting men and chariots. The 10 governments differed from each other in details concerning military requirements. Each of the kings of Atlantis had complete control over his own kingdom, but their mutual relationships were governed by a code engraved by the first 10 kings on a column of orichalch standing in the temple of Poseidon. At alternate intervals of 5 and 6 years, a pilgrimage was made to this temple that equal honor might be conferred upon both the odd and the even numbers. Here, with appropriate sacrifice, each king renewed his oath of loyalty upon the sacred inscription. Here also the kings donned azure robes and sat in judgment. At daybreak they wrote their sentences upon a golden tablet and deposited them with their robes as memorials. The chief laws of the Atlantean kings were that they should not take up arms against each other, and that they should come to the assistance of any of their number who was attacked. In matters of war and great moment, the final decision was in the hands of the direct descendants of the family of Atlas. No king had the power of life and death over his kinsmen without the assent of a majority of the 10. Plato concludes his description by declaring that it was this great empire which attacked the Hellenic states. This did not occur, however, until their power and glory had lured the Atlantean kings from the pathway of wisdom and virtue. Filled with false ambition, the rulers of Atlantis determined to conquer the entire world. Zeus, perceiving the wickedness of the Atlanteans, gathered the gods into his holy habitation and addressed them. Here Plato's narrative comes to an abrupt end, for the Critias was never finished. In the Timaeus is a further description of Atlantis, supposedly given to Solon by an Egyptian priest, and which concludes as follows: "But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods. And in a single day and night of rain, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared, and was sunk beneath the sea. And that is the reason why the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is such a quantity of shallow mud in the way. And this was caused by the subsidence of the island." In the introduction to his translation of the Timaeus, Thomas Taylor quotes from a history of Ethiopia written by Marcellus, which contains the following reference to Atlantis. "For they relate that in their time there were 7 islands in the Atlantic Sea, sacred to Proserpine, and besides these, 3 others of an immense magnitude, one of which was sacred to Pluto, another to Ammon, and another, which is the middle of these, and is of 1,000 stadia, to Neptune." Crantor, commenting upon Plato, asserted that the Egyptian priests declared the story of Atlantis to be written upon pillars, which were still preserved circa 300 BC. Ignatius Donnelly, who gave the subject of Atlantis profound study, believed that horses were first domesticated by the Atlanteans, for which reason they have always been considered peculiarly sacred to Poseidon. From a careful consideration of Plato's description of Atlantis, it is evident that the story should not be regarded as wholly historical, but rather as both allegorical and historical. Origen, Porphyry, Proclus, Iamblichus, and Syrianus realized that the story concealed a profound philosophical mystery, but they disagreed as to the actual interpretation. Plato's Atlantis symbolizes the threefold nature of both the universe and the human body. The 10 kings of Atlantis are the tetracties, or numbers, which are born as 5 pairs of opposites. The numbers 1 to 10 rule every creature, and the numbers, in turn, are under the control of the monad, or 1, the eldest among them. With the trident scepter of Poseidon, these kings held sway over the inhabitants of the 7 small and 3 great islands comprising Atlantis. Philosophically, the 10 islands symbolize the triune powers of the superior deity and the 7 regents who bow before his eternal throne. If Atlantis be considered as the archetypal sphere, then its immersion signifies the descent of rational, organized consciousness into the illusionary, impermanent realm of irrational, mortal ignorance. Both the sinking of Atlantis and the biblical story of the fall of man signify spiritual involution, a prerequisite to conscious evolution. Either the initiated Plato used the Atlantis allegory to achieve 2 widely different ends, or else the accounts preserved by the Egyptian priests were tampered with to perpetuate the secret doctrine. This does not mean to imply that Atlantis is purely mythological, but it overcomes the most serious obstacle to acceptance of the Atlantis theory, namely, the fantastic accounts of its origin, size, appearance, and date of destruction. 9600 BC, in the midst of the central island of Atlantis, was a lofty mountain which cast a shadow 5,000 stadia in extent and whose summit touched the sphere of Etha. This is the axle mountain of the world, sacred among many races and symbolic of the human head, which rises out of the 4 elements of the body. This sacred mountain, upon whose summit stood the temple of the gods, gave rise to the stories of Olympus, Meru, and Asgard. The city of the Golden Gates, the capital of Atlantis, is the one now preserved among numerous religions as the city of the gods, or the Holy City. Here is the archetype of the New Jerusalem, with its streets paved with gold and its 12 gates shining with precious stones. The history of Atlantis, writes Ignatius Donnelly, is the key of the Greek mythology. There can be no question that these gods of Greece were human beings. The tendency to attach divine attributes to great earthly rulers is one deeply implanted in human nature. The same author sustains his views by noting that the deities of the Greek pantheon were not looked upon as creators of the universe, but rather as regents set over it by its more ancient original fabricators. The Garden of Eden, from which humanity was driven by a flaming sword, is perhaps an allusion to the earthly paradise supposedly located west of the Pillars of Hercules and destroyed by volcanic cataclysms. The deluge legend may be traced also to the Atlantean inundation, during which a world was destroyed by water. Was the religious, philosophically, and scientific knowledge possessed by the priestcrafts of antiquity secured from Atlantis, whose submergence obliterated every vestige of its part in the drama of world progress? Atlantean sun worship has been perpetuated in the ritualism and ceremonialism of both Christianity and pagandom. Both the cross and the serpent were Atlantean emblems of divine wisdom. The divine, Atlantean, progenitors of the Mayas and Quiches of Central America coexisted within the green and azure radiance of Gucumatz, the plumed serpent. The 6 skyborn sages came into manifestation as centers of light bound together or synthesized by the 7th, and chief of their order, the feathered snake. The title of winged or plumed snake was applied to Quetzalcoatl, or Kukulkan, the Central American initiate. The center of the Atlantean wisdom religion was presumably a great pyramidal temple standing on the brow of a plateau rising in the midst of the city of the Golden Gates. From here, the initiate priests of the sacred feather went forth, carrying the keys of universal wisdom to the uttermost parts of the earth. The mythologies of many nations contain accounts of gods who came out of the sea. Certain shamans among the American Indians tell of holy men dressed in birds' feathers and wampum who rose out of the blue waters and instructed them in the arts and crafts. Among the legends of the Chaldeans is that of Ons, a partly amphibious creature who came out of the sea and taught the savage peoples along the shore to read and write, till the soil, cultivate herbs for healing, study the stars, establish rational forms of government, and become conversant with the sacred mysteries. Among the Mayas, Quetzalcoatl, the savior god, whom some Christian scholars believe to have been St. Thomas, issued from the waters and, after instructing the people in the essentials of civilization, rode out to sea on a magic raft of serpents to escape the wrath of the fierce god of the fiery mirror, Tezcatlipoca. May it not have been that these demigods of a fabulous age who, Esdras-like, came out of the sea were Atlantean priests? All that primitive man remembered of the Atlanteans was the glory of their golden ornaments, the transcendency of their wisdom, and the sanctity of their symbols, the cross and the serpent. That they came in ships was soon forgotten, for untutored minds considered even boats as supernatural. Wherever the Atlanteans proselyted, they erected pyramids and temples patterned after the great sanctuary in the city of the Golden Gates. Such is the origin of the pyramids of Egypt, Mexico, and Central America. The mounds in Normandy and Britain, as well as those of the American Indians, are remnants of a similar culture. In the midst of the Atlantean program of world colonization and conversion, the cataclysms which sank Atlantis began. The initiate priests of the sacred feather who promised to come back to their missionary settlements never returned. And after the lapse of centuries, tradition preserved only a fantastic account of gods who came from a place where the sea now is. H.P. Blavatsky thus sums up the causes which precipitated the Atlantean disaster. Under the evil insinuations of their demon, the Vedat, the Atlantis race became a nation of wicked magicians. In consequence of this, war was declared, the story of which would be too long to narrate. Its substance may be found in the disfigured allegories of the race of Cain, the giants, and that of Noah and his righteous family. The conflict came to an end by the submersion of the Atlantis, which finds its imitation in the stories of the Babylonian and Mosaic flood. The giants and magicians and all flesh died, and every man. Except Xisuthros and Noah, who are substantially identical with the great father of the Tlachtlinkithians and the Popol Vuh, or the sacred book of the Guatemalans, which also tells of his escaping in a large boat, like the Hindu Noah Vaiswasvata. From the Atlanteans, the world has received not only the heritage of arts and crafts, philosophies and sciences, ethics and religions, but also the heritage of hate, strife, and perversion. The Atlanteans instigated the first war. and it has been said that all subsequent wars were fought in a fruitless effort to justify the first one and right the wrong which it caused. Before Atlantis sank, its spiritually illumined initiates, who realized that their land was doomed because it had departed from the path of light, withdrew from the ill-fated continent. Carrying with them the sacred and secret doctrine, these Atlanteans established themselves in Egypt, where they became its first, divine, rulers. Nearly all the great cosmologic myths, forming the foundation of the various sacred books of the world, are based upon the Atlantean mystery rituals. The myth of Tammuz and Ishtar is one of the earliest examples of the dying god allegory. Probably antedating 4000 BC, the imperfect condition of the tablets upon which the legends are inscribed makes it impossible to secure more than a fragmentary account of the Tammuz rites. Being the esoteric god of the sun, Tammuz did not occupy a position among the first deities venerated by the Babylonians, who for lack of deeper knowledge looked upon him as a god of agriculture or a vegetation spirit. Originally, he was described as being one of the guardians of the gates of the underworld. Like many other savior gods, he is referred to as a shepherd or the lord of the shepherd seat. Tammuz occupies the remarkable position of son and husband of Ishtar, the Babylonian and Assyrian mother goddess. Ishtar, to whom the planet Venus was sacred, was the most widely venerated deity of the Babylonian and Assyrian pantheon. She was probably identical with Ashur-Tor, Astarte, and Aphrodite. The story of her descent into the underworld in search presumably for the sacred elixir, which alone could restore Tammuz to life, is the key to the ritual of her mysteries. Tammuz, whose annual festival took place just before the summer solstice, died in midsummer in the ancient month which bore his name and was mourned with elaborate ceremonies. The manner of his death is unknown, but some of the accusations made against Ishtar by Isjubar, Nimrod, would indicate that she, indirectly at least, had contributed to his demise. The resurrection of Tammuz was the occasion of great rejoicing, at which time he was hailed as a redeemer of his people. With outspread wings, Ishtar, the daughter of Sin, the moon, sweeps downward to the gates of death. The house of darkness, the dwelling of the god Urkela, is described as the place of no return. It is without light. The nourishment of those who dwell therein is dust, and their food is mud. Over the bolts on the door of the house of Urkela is scattered dust, and the keepers of the house are covered with feathers like birds. Ishtar demands that the keepers open the gates, declaring that if they do not, she will shatter the doorposts and strike the hinges and raise up dead devourers of the living. The guardians of the gates beg her to be patient while they go to the queen of Hades, from whom they secure permission to admit Ishtar, but only in the same manner as all others came to this dreary house. Ishtar thereupon descends through the 7 gates which lead downward into the depths of the underworld. At the first gate, the great crown is removed from her head. At the second gate, the earrings from her ears. At the third gate, the necklace from her neck. At the fourth gate, the ornaments from her breast. At the fifth gate, the girdle from her waist. At the sixth gate, the bracelets from her hands and feet. And at the 7th gate, the covering cloak of her body. Ishtar remonstrates as each successive article of apparel is taken from her, but the guardian tells her that this is the experience of all who enter the somber domain of death. Enraged upon beholding Ishtar, the mistress of Hades inflicts upon her all manner of disease and imprisons her in the underworld. As Ishtar represents the spirit of fertility, her loss prevents the ripening of the crops and the maturing of all life upon the earth. In this respect, the story parallels the legend of Persephone. The gods, realizing that the loss of Ishtar is disorganizing all nature, send a messenger to the underworld and demand her release. The mistress of Hades is forced to comply, and the water of life is poured over Ishtar. Thus cured of the infirmities inflicted on her, she retraces her way upward through the 7 gates, at each of which she is reinvested with the article of apparel which the guardians had removed. No record exists that Ishtar secured the water of life which would have wrought the resurrection of Tammuz. The myth of Ishtar symbolizes the descent of the human spirit through the 7 worlds, or spheres of the sacred planets, until finally, deprived of its spiritual adornments, it incarnates in the physical body, Hades, where the mistress of that body heaps every form of sorrow and misery upon the imprisoned consciousness. The waters of life, the secret doctrine, cure the diseases of ignorance. And the spirit, ascending again to its divine source, regains its God-given adornments as it passes upward through the rings of the planets. Another mystery ritual among the Babylonians and Assyrians was that of Merodach and the dragon. Merodach, the creator of the inferior universe, slays a horrible monster, and out of her body forms the universe. Here is the probable source of the so-called Christian allegory of St. George and the dragon. The mysteries of Adonis or Adoni were celebrated annually in many parts of Egypt, Phoenicia, and Byblos. The name Adonis or Adoni means Lord and was a designation applied to the sun and later borrowed by the Jews as the exoteric name of their god. Smyrna, mother of Adonis, was turned into a tree by the gods, and after a time the bark burst open and the infant savior issued forth. According to one account, he was liberated by a wild boar which split the wood of the maternal tree with its tusks. Adonis was born at midnight of the 24th of December, and through his unhappy death, a mystery rite was established that wrought the salvation of his people. In the Jewish month of Tammuz, another name for this deity, he was gored to death by a wild boar sent by the god Mars. The Adoniasmos was the ceremony of lamenting the premature death of the murdered god. In Ezekiel, Roman 8:14, it is written that women were weeping for Tammuz, Adonis, at the north gate of the Lord's house in Jerusalem. Sir James George Fraser cites Jerome thus. He tells us that Bethlehem, the traditionary birthplace of the Lord, was shaded by a grove of that still older Syrian lord Adonis, and that where the infant Jesus had wept, the lover of Venus was bewailed. The effigy of a wild boar is said to have been set over one of the gates of Jerusalem in honor of Adonis, and his rites celebrated in the grotto of the Nativity at Bethlehem. Adonis, as the gored man, is one of the keys to Sir Francis Bacon's use of the wild boar in his cryptic symbolism. Adonis was originally an androgynous deity who represented the solar power, which in the winter was destroyed by the evil principle of cold, the boar. After 3 days, months in the tomb, Adonis rose triumphant on the 25th day of March, amidst the acclamation of his priests and followers. He is risen. Adonis was born out of a myrrh tree. Myrrh, the symbol of death because of its connection with the process of embalming, was one of the gifts brought by the 3 magi to the manger of Jesus. In the mysteries of Adonis, the neophyte passed through the symbolic death of the god, and, raised by the priests, entered into the blessed state of redemption made possible by the sufferings of Adonis. Nearly all authors believe Adonis to have been originally a vegetation god, directly connected with the growth and maturing of flowers and fruits. In support of this viewpoint, they describe the gardens of Adonis, which were small baskets of earth in which seeds were planted and nurtured for a period of 8 days. When those plants prematurely died for lack of sufficient earth, they were considered emblematic of the murdered Adonis and were usually cast into the sea with images of the god. In Phrygia, there existed a remarkable school of religious philosophy which centered around the life and untimely fate of another savior god known as Hades or Attis, by many considered synonymous with Adonis. This deity was born at midnight on the 24th day of December. Of his death, there are 2 accounts. In one, he was gored to death like Adonis. In the other, he emasculated himself under a pine tree and there died. His body was taken to a cave by the Great Mother, Cybele, where it remained through the ages without decaying. To the rites of Hades, the modern world is indebted for the symbolism of the Christmas tree. Hades imparted his immortality to the tree beneath which he died, and Cybele took the tree with her when she removed the body. Hades remained 3 days in the tomb, rose upon a date corresponding with Easter morn, and by this resurrection overcame death for all who were initiated into his mysteries. In the mysteries of the Phrygians, says Julius Firmicus, which are called those of the mother of the gods, every year a pine tree is cut down, and in the inside of the tree the image of a youth is tied in. In the mysteries of Isis, the trunk of a pine tree is cut. The middle of the trunk is nicely hollowed out. The idol of Osiris made from those hollowed pieces is buried. In the mysteries of Proserpine, a tree cut is put together into the effigy and form of the Virgin, and when it has been carried within the city, it is mourned 40 nights, but the 40th night it is burned. The mysteries of Hades included a sacramental meal during which the neophyte ate out of a drum and drank from a cymbal. After being baptized by the blood of a bull, the new initiate was fed entirely on milk to symbolize that he was still a philosophical infant, having but recently been born out of the sphere of materiality. Is there a possible connection between this lacteal diet prescribed by the Attic rite and St. Paul's allusion to the food for spiritual babes? Sallust gives a key to the esoteric interpretation of the Attic rituals. Cybele, the Great Mother, signifies the vivifying powers of the universe, and Hades that aspect of the spiritual intellect which is suspended between the divine and animal spheres. The mother of the gods, loving Hades, gave him a starry hat, signifying celestial powers, but Hades, mankind, falling in love with a nymph, symbolic of the lower animal propensities, forfeited his divinity and lost his creative powers. It is thus evident that Hades represents the human consciousness, and that his mysteries are concerned with the reattainment of the starry hat. The rites of Sabazius were very similar to those of Bacchus, and it is generally believed that the two deities are identical. Bacchus was born at Sabazius, or Sabaoth, and these names are frequently assigned to him. The Sabazian mysteries were performed at night, and the ritual included the drawing of a live snake across the breast of the candidate. Clement of Alexandria writes, "The token of the Sabazian mysteries to the initiated is the deity gliding over the breast. A golden serpent was the symbol of Sabazius because this deity represented the annual renovation of the world by the solar power. The Jews borrowed the name Sabaoth from these mysteries and adopted it as one of the appellations of their supreme god. During the time the Sabazian mysteries were celebrated in Rome, the cult gained many votaries and later influenced the symbolism of Christianity. The Kabiric mysteries of Samothrace were renowned among the ancients, being next to the Eleusinian in public esteem. Herodotus declares that the Samothracians received their doctrines, especially those concerning Mercury, from the Pelasgians. Little is known concerning the Kabiric rituals, for they were enshrouded in the profoundest secrecy. Some regard the Kabiri as 7 in number and refer to them as the 7 spirits of fire before the throne of Saturn. Others believe the Kabiri to be the 7 sacred wanderers, later called the planets. While a vast number of deities are associated with the Samothracian mysteries, the ritualistic drama centers around 4 brothers. The first 3, Ashiros, Achiatsaris, and Achiatsara, attack and murder the 4th, Kashmala or Cadmulus. Dionysiodorus, however, identifies Ashiros with Demeter, Achiatsaris with Pluto, Achiatsara with Persephone, and Kashmala with Hermes. Alexander Wilder notes that in the Samothracian ritual, Cadmulus is made to include the Theban serpent god, Cadmus, the Thoth of Egypt, the Hermes of the Greeks, and the Ameph or Aesculapius of the Alexandrians and Phoenicians. Here again is a repetition of the story of Osiris, Bacchus, Adonis, Balder, and Hiram Abiff. The worship of Hades and Cybele was also involved in the Samothracian mysteries. In the rituals of the Kabiri is to be traced a form of pine tree worship. For this tree, sacred to Hades, was first trimmed into the form of a cross and then cut down in honor of the murdered god whose body was discovered at its foot. If you wish to inspect the orgies of the Corybantes, writes Clement, then know that, having killed their 3rd brother, they covered the head of the dead body with a purple cloth, crowned it, and carrying it on the point of a spear, buried it under the roots of Olympus. These mysteries are, in short, murders and funerals. And the priests of these rites, who are called kings of the sacred rites by those whose business it is to name them, give additional strangeness to the tragic occurrence, by forbidding parsley with the roots from being placed on the table, for they think that parsley grew from the corybantic blood that flowed forth. Just as the women, in celebrating the Thesmophoria, abstain from eating the seeds of the pomegranate, which have fallen on the ground, from the idea that pomegranates sprang from the drops of the blood of Dionysus. Those Corybantes also they call Kabiric, and the ceremony itself they announce as the Kabiric mystery. The mysteries of the Kabiri were divided into 3 degrees, the first of which celebrated the death of Kashmala at the hands of his 3 brothers. The second, the discovery of his mutilated body, the parts of which had been found and gathered after much labor. And the third, accompanied by great rejoicing and happiness, his resurrection and the consequent salvation of the world. The temple of the Kabiri at Samothrace contained a number of curious divinities, many of them misshapen creatures representing the elemental powers of nature, possibly the Bacchic Titans. Children were initiated into the Kabirian cult with the same dignity as adults, and criminals who reached the sanctuary were safe from pursuit. The Samothracian rites were particularly concerned with navigation, the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, or the gods of navigation, being among those propitiated by members of that cult. The Argonautic expedition, listening to the advice of Orpheus, stopped at the island of Samothrace for the purpose of having its members initiated into the Kabiric rites. Herodotus relates that when Cambyses entered the temple of the Kabiri, he was unable to restrain his mirth at seeing before him the figure of a man standing upright, and, facing the man, the figure of a woman standing on her head. Had Cambyses been acquainted with the principles of divine astronomy, he would have realized that he was then in the presence of the key to universal equilibrium. "I ask," says Voltaire, "who were these hierophants, these sacred Freemasons, who celebrated their ancient mysteries of Samothracia, and whence came they and their gods Kabiri?" Clement speaks of the mysteries of the Kabiri as the sacred mystery of a brother slain by his brethren, and the Kabiric death was one of the secret symbols of antiquity. Thus the allegory of the self murdered by the not-self is perpetuated through the religious mysticism of all peoples. The philosophically death and the philosophically resurrection are the lesser and the greater mysteries respectively. A curious aspect of the dying god myth is that of the hanged man. The most important example of this peculiar conception is found in the Odinic rituals, where Odin hangs himself for 9 nights from the branches of the world tree, and upon the same occasion also pierces his own side with the sacred spear. As the result of this great sacrifice, Odin, while suspended over the depths of Niflheim, discovered by meditation the runes or alphabets by which later the records of his people were preserved. Because of this remarkable experience, Odin is sometimes shown seated on a gallows tree, and he became the patron deity of all who died by the noose. Esoterically, the hanged man is the human spirit which is suspended from heaven by a single thread. Wisdom, not death, is the reward for this voluntary sacrifice, during which the human soul, suspended above the world of illusion and meditating upon its unreality, is rewarded by the achievement of self-realization. From a consideration of all these ancient and secret rituals, it becomes evident that the mystery of the dying god was universal among the illumined and venerated colleges of the sacred teaching. This mystery has been perpetuated in Christianity in the crucifixion and death of the God-man, Jesus the Christ. The secret import of this world tragedy and the universal martyr must be rediscovered if Christianity is to reach the heights attained by the pagans in the days of their philosophically supremacy. The myth of the dying god is the key to both universal and individual redemption and regeneration, and those who do not comprehend the true nature of this supreme allegory are not privileged to consider themselves either wise or truly religious. Thunder rolled, lightning flashed, the veil of the temple was rent from top to bottom. The venerable initiator, in his robes of blue and gold, slowly raised his jeweled wand and pointed with it into the darkness revealed by the tearing of the silken curtain. "Behold the light of Egypt." The candidate, in his plain white robe, gazed into the utter blackness framed by the 2 great lotus-headed columns between which the veil had hung. As he watched, a luminous haze distributed itself throughout the atmosphere until the air was a mass of shining particles. The face of the neophyte was illumined by the soft glow as he scanned the shimmering cloud for some tangible object. The initiator spoke again. "This light which ye behold is the secret luminance of the mysteries. Whence it comes none knoweth, save the master of the light. Behold him." Suddenly, through the gleaming mist a figure appeared, surrounded by a flickering greenish sheen. The initiator lowered his wand and, bowing his head, placed one hand edgewise against his breast in humble salutation. The neophyte stepped back in awe, partly blinded by the glory of the revealed figure. Gaining courage, the youth gazed again at the divine one. The form before him was considerably larger than that of a mortal man. The body seemed partly transparent, so that the heart and brain could be seen pulsating and radiant. As the candidate watched, the heart changed into an ibis and the brain into a flashing emerald. In its hand, this mysterious being bore a winged rod entwined with serpents. The aged initiator, raising his wand, cried out in a loud voice, "All hail thee, Thoth Hermes thrice greatest! All hail thee, Prince of Men! All hail thee who standeth upon the head of Typhon!" At the same instant, a lurid writhing dragon appeared, a hideous monster, part serpent, part crocodile, and part hog. From its mouth and nostrils poured sheets of flame, and horrible sounds echoed through the vaulted chambers. Suddenly, Hermes struck the advancing reptile with the serpentine staff, and with snarling cry, the dragon fell over upon its side, while the flames about it slowly died away. Hermes placed his foot upon the skull of the vanquished Typhon. The next instant, with a blaze of unbearable glory that sent the neophyte staggering backward against a pillar, the immortal Hermes, followed by streamers of greenish mist, passed through the chamber and faded into nothingness. Iamblichus averred that Hermes was the author of 20,000 books. Manetho increased the number to more than 36,000. Figures which make it evident that a solitary individual, even though he be overshadowed by divine prerogative, could scarcely have accomplished such a monumental labor. Among the arts and sciences which it is affirmed Hermes revealed to mankind were medicine, chemistry, law, art, astrology, music, rhetoric, magic, philosophy, geography, mathematics, especially geometry, anatomy, and oratory. Orpheus was similarly acclaimed by the Greeks. In his Biographia Antiqua, Francis Barrett says of Hermes, "If God ever appeared in man, he appeared in him, as is evident both from his books and his Pymander, in which works he has communicated the sum of the abyss and the divine knowledge to all posterity, by which he has demonstrated himself to have been not only an inspired divine, but also a deep philosopher, obtaining his wisdom from God and heavenly things, and not from man." His transcendent learning caused Hermes to be identified with many of the early sages and prophets. In his ancient mythology, Bryant writes, "I have mentioned that Cadmus was the same as the Egyptian Thoth, and it is manifest from his being Hermes, and from the invention of letters being attributed to him. Investigators believe that it was Hermes who was known to the Jews as Enoch, called by Kenneally the second messenger of God. Hermes was accepted into the mythology of the Greeks, later becoming the Mercury of the Latins. He was revered through the form of the planet Mercury because this body is nearest to the sun. Hermes of all creatures was nearest to God and became known as the messenger of the gods. In the Egyptian drawings of him, Thoth carries a waxen writing tablet and serves as the recorder during the weighing of the souls of the dead in the judgment hall of Osiris, a ritual of great significance. Hermes is of first importance to Masonic scholars because he was the author of the Masonic initiatory rituals, which were borrowed from the mysteries established by Hermes. Nearly all of the Masonic symbols are Hermetic in character. Pythagoras studied mathematics with the Egyptians, and from them gained his knowledge of the symbolic geometric solids. Hermes is also revered for his reformation of the calendar system. He increased the year from 360 to 365 days, thus establishing a precedent which still prevails. The appellation thrice greatest was given to Hermes because he was considered the greatest of all philosophers, the greatest of all priests, and the greatest of all kings. It is worthy of note that the last poem of America's beloved poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, was a lyric ode to Hermes. On the subject of the Hermetic books, James Campbell Brown, in his History of Chemistry, has written, "Leaving the Chaldean and earliest Egyptian periods, of which we have remains but no record, and from which no names of either chemists or philosophers have come down to us, we now approach the historic period, when books were written, not at first upon parchment or paper, but upon papyrus." A series of early Egyptian books is attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, who may have been a real savant or may be a personification of a long succession of writers. He is identified by some with the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth or Tuti, who was the moon god, and is represented in ancient paintings as ibis-headed with the disk and crescent of the moon. The Egyptians regarded him as the god of wisdom, letters, and the recording of time. It is in consequence of the great respect entertained for Hermes by the old alchemists that chemical writings were called hermetic, and that the phrase hermetically sealed is still in use to designate the closing of a glass vessel by fusion, after the manner of chemical manipulators. We find the same root in the Hermetic medicines of Paracelsus and the Hermetic Freemasonry of the Middle Ages. Among the fragmentary writings believed to have come from the stylus of Hermes are two famous works. The first is the Emerald Table, and the second is the Divine Pymander, or, as it is more commonly called, the Shepherd of Men, a discussion of which follows. One outstanding point in connection with Hermes is that he was one of the few philosopher priests of pagandom upon whom the early Christians did not vent their spleen. Some church fathers went so far as to declare that Hermes exhibited many symptoms of intelligence, and that if he had only been born in a more enlightened age, so that he might have benefited by their instructions, he would have been a really great man. In his Stromata, Clement of Alexandria, one of the few chroniclers of pagan lore whose writings have been preserved to this age, gives practically all the information that is known concerning the original 42 books of Hermes and the importance with which these books were regarded by both the temporal and spiritual powers of Egypt. Clement describes one of their ceremonial processions as follows. For the Egyptians pursue a philosophy of their own. This is principally shown by their sacred ceremonial. For first advances the singer, bearing one of the symbols of music. For they say that he must learn 2 of the books of Hermes, the one of which contains the hymns of the gods, the second the regulations for the king's life. And after the singer advances the astrologer, with a horologe in his hand, and a palm, the symbols of astrology. He must have the astrological books of Hermes, which are 4 in number, always in his mouth. Of these, one is about the order of the fixed stars that are visible, and another about the conjunctions and luminous appearances of the sun and moon, and the rest respecting their risings. Next in order advances the sacred scribe, with wings on his head, and in his hand a book and rule, in which were writing ink and the reed, with which they write. And he must be acquainted with what are called hieroglyphics, and know about cosmography and geography, the position of the sun and moon, and about the 5 planets. Also the description of Egypt and the chart of the Nile, and the description of the equipment of the priests and of the place consecrated to them, and about the measures and the things in use in the sacred rites. Then the stole-keeper follows those previously mentioned, with the cubit of justice and the cup for libations. He is acquainted with all points called pedeutic, relating to training, and moscophilic, sacrificial. There are also 10 books which relate to the honor paid by them to their gods and containing the Egyptian worship, as that relating to sacrifices, first fruits, hymns, prayers, processions, festivals, and the like. And behind all walks the prophet, with the water vase carried openly in his arms, who is followed by those who carry the issue of loaves. He, as being the governor of the temple, learns the 10 books called hieratic. And they contain all about the laws, and the gods, and the whole of the training of the priests. For the prophet is, among the Egyptians, also over the distribution of the revenues. There are then 42 books of Hermes indispensably necessary, of which the 36 containing the whole philosophy of the Egyptians are learned by the forementioned personages, and the other 6, which are medical, by the pastophor, image-bearers, treating of the structure of the body, and of disease and instruments and medicines, and about the eyes, and the last about women. One of the greatest tragedies of the philosophically world was the loss of nearly all of the 42 books of Hermes mentioned in the foregoing. These books disappeared during the burning of Alexandria, for the Romans, and later the Christians, realized that until these books were eliminated, they could never bring the Egyptians into subjection. The volumes which escaped the fire were buried in the desert, and their location is now known to only a few initiates of the secret schools. While Hermes still walked the earth with men, he entrusted to his chosen successors the sacred Book of Thoth. This work contained the secret processes by which the regeneration of humanity was to be accomplished, and also served as the key to his other writings. Nothing definite is known concerning the contents of the Book of Thoth, other than that its pages were covered with strange hieroglyphic figures and symbols, which gave to those acquainted with their use unlimited power over the spirits of the air and the subterranean divinities. When certain areas of the brain are stimulated by the secret processes of the mysteries, the consciousness of man is extended, and he is permitted to behold the immortals and enter into the presence of the superior gods. The Book of Thoth described the method whereby this stimulation was accomplished. In truth, therefore, it was the key to immortality. According to legend, the Book of Thoth was kept in a golden box in the inner sanctuary of the temple. There was but one key, and this was in the possession of the Master of the Mysteries, the highest initiate of the Hermetic Arcanum. He alone knew what was written in the secret book. The Book of Thoth was lost to the ancient world with the decay of the mysteries, but its faithful initiates carried it sealed in the sacred casket into another land. The book is still in existence and continues to lead the disciples of this age into the presence of the immortals. No other information can be given to the world concerning it now, but the apostolic succession from the first Hierophant, initiated by Hermes, himself remains unbroken to this day. And those who are peculiarly fitted to serve the immortals may discover this priceless document if they will search sincerely and tirelessly for it. It has been asserted that the Book of Thoth is, in reality, the mysterious tarot of the Bohemians, a strange emblematic book of 78 leaves which has been in possession of the gypsies since the time when they were driven from their ancient temple, the Serapeum. According to the secret histories, the gypsies were originally Egyptian priests. There are now in the world several secret schools privileged to initiate candidates into the mysteries, but in nearly every instance, they lighted their altar fires from the flaming torch of Hermes in his Book of Thoth revealed to all mankind the one way. And for ages the wise of every nation and every faith have reached immortality by the way established by Hermes in the midst of the darkness for the redemption of humankind.